Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. I'm Charles Williams, and together we'll explore untold stories, bold ideas, and innovative approaches that transform our schools and communities. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. As always, thank you so much for rejoining me in this space. Obviously, if you are watching, thank you so much for checking out these new platforms, really leaning into it. And if you're just listening, like the traditional version, thank you so much for joining. As you're watching and listening to these episodes, we are well into the 200s. And so one of the things you'll notice is that I typically have a lot of guests on that I've spent time with in some way, shape, or form in various spaces. But tonight's guest is a little bit different. I have not had the chance to spend time, but in our brief like pre-conversation, I definitely want to connect, and I cannot wait to potentially share some space in the future. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing, but the story that this gentleman has seems phenomenal, and I cannot wait to learn more. This is going to be a journey for both of us, watchers, listeners, as we get to know a little bit more about our guest tonight, Jose Moreno. Jose, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And just from a little pre-conversation, I'm super excited about this.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I'm like, man, this is going to go so many different ways. It feels like it's going to be one of those energetic ones. And I love these conversations. So before we jump in to the meat, the content of everything, why don't you share a little bit about who you are, the work that you do, your background? I know you have a company that might benefit some of us educators in this space, but just let us know, who is Jose Moreno?
Yeah, so born and raised in LA, and math and computers have always kind of been my thing growing up. I always thought I was going to be a mathematician is what I would say when I was a kid. But at some point, my high school offered a computer science course, and I ended up falling in love with it. And so I just went into computers. When I graduated from Harvey-Mudd College, I worked at Microsoft for about 5.5 years. And then I spent my last 9 years working for Netflix. So working for big tech companies that are super impactful, and Netflix more than Microsoft that people love has been quite a blessing. And over the last year and a half, I just started wondering what's next. And so I just started thinking about like where we can have impact, where I could take a lot of the skills that I've learned to have a little bit more of a positive impact on society. And I ended up landing into EdTech. My cousin is a vice principal for a school in LAUSD with students with special needs. And she started telling me about the multi-tier systems of support, or PBIS or RTI frameworks, and how beneficial they could be when they're implemented well, which is kind of a big key there. But implementing it well has been a challenge in education. And so I've looked at a lot of studies there, and it looks like it's a continuing challenge. And so with the evolution of AI, we decided to build IntelliTier, which helps personalize student support following these MTSS frameworks. And so, a bit of a plug for the company and what we're working on. But that's me.
Yeah, no, not a problem. I'm curious, your cousin in LA, who is the vice principal out there, can we give her a shout out?
Yeah, Dr. Erica Moreno. Actually, she just graduated with her PhD or EDD. So
wonderful.
That's great to see. Yeah.
Congratulations, Dr. Moreno. I was going to mess with you and be like, oh, I know, but I don't. But shout out to you.
I honestly wouldn't be surprised. She's a superstar, so.
Hey. Maybe we'll have to get Dr. Moreno on in a future episode. And thank you for inspiring you to lend those talents to our ed space. I mean, from like Microsoft to Netflix, those are not small spaces to say, you know what, I'm going to bring these talents into the edu world and really help out some of those systems that you have in place. So I know I was browsing around this in Teletech, and I was like, this seems interesting. Learn more about it on a later call.
Yeah.
But I'm curious. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I was looking at it. I was like, this seems, we have some tools here and there, but I'm always looking to see like, what tool better fits, our needs.
The
So I was like,
the feedback that we're getting is that there hasn't been anything like this in the space so far, and it is really simplifying the research process for intervention strategies that are being planned for students. My hope is that we can provide the most effective ones out there to really be able to benefit students and schools and save teachers some time.
that's awesome. I appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely might want to pick your brain. I know I've started just looking at, so I have the opportunity to speak at conferences all over the country and beyond. And one of the things that I wanted to start leaning into is that intersectionality of like AI and mental health. And
Yep.
so, I started playing around a little bit and I was like, this might be, maybe in the future, listeners, you'll see Williams and Moreno speaking somewhere. Who knows? We'll see. We'll see.
That'd be awesome.
But I know that isn't necessarily the focus for our conversation tonight. So as we dive in, right, the whole point of the show is to push back, to present a different perspective on things, to counter the narrative that might exist, especially for some of our most marginalized populations. And I know some of what we started talking about already, this might ruffle some feathers, and that's okay, because I tell people all the time, like, if you're listening to the show, you know what you're getting yourself into, right? We're not here to sugarcoat. We're not here to just appease. We are here to have those real, honest conversations and to share a different perspective. And so I'm curious, what is it that you want to talk about this evening?
I mean, based off of what we were talking about and what usually gets talked about in the podcast, I'd really love to give a shout out to my mom. And my family. I wouldn't be where I am today without her, and it's been quite a sacrifice and quite a life that she's lived. I'm pushing her to write a book because it's a pretty impressive story. But really quickly, we are originally from El Salvador. My family is, and she actually grew up in a pretty well-off situation in El Salvador. It was like 13 siblings, and most of them went to private school because my grandfather had like a pretty successful business out in El Salvador, sort of thing, and multiple like people helping out around their house. And so a very sort of cushy situation my mom grew up in. But there was a civil war that broke out in El Salvador in late 70s, early 80s. And at some point, my mom's life was threatened. So she had to migrate over to the United States and kind of like start over from there. And I think what really impresses me about my mom is that she grew up in that sort of cushy situation, right? But when she came to the US, she had nothing. She had to work multiple jobs. She had me. I grew up in LA, born and raised in LA. And my father split at some point. So she was a single mother with multiple jobs, just trying to figure out how to get me and my sister ahead, and so we powered through it and really kind of grew from that.
So, Jose, I got to ask you, because you said, I want to give mom a shout out.
Yeah.
And I was like, but you didn't give mom a shout out. So let's pause for a moment. Let's give mom a shout out, because that's an amazing story, right? Of this triumph of overcoming. So definitely let's give mom a quick shout out.
Yeah, Ana Asensio, her birthday was yesterday, turned 65. So I'm very proud of her there. And I love you, mom. Yeah, thanks for everything.
That's even better. Look at that. On her birthday, her name is Anna, you said, correct?
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. That is my mother-in-law's name.
Oh, really?
So must be a special woman. So happy belated birthday, Anna. I hope all is going well, and huge shout out to you. So, Jose, I appreciate you sharing this. And I think, what you shared may be like a surprise moment for some individuals. But in much of the work that I've done, I've shared oftentimes that my work in the ed space started off with, at the time, we called it the bilingual program. Right now, we call it ELs. But like, that is where my work started. And one of the things that I remember originally being surprised to learn is how many of our students, their families were, as you mentioned, successful in other spaces. I remember even working, very closely with one of our TAs, only to find out that this gentleman was a doctor, from the country where he came from. And so I think there's a perspective that we often have. It's those internal biases that we carry with us. But the stories, the livelihoods of these individuals coming in, may not always fit that narrative. And so I'm curious, as we're talking this evening, right, and you're sharing this story, like, Why do you think this is so important to be sharing with our listeners today?
I think there's a lot of like misconceptions about the motivation of people that are immigrating into the US. Like people aren't coming here just to try to steal jobs from like, yeah, I guess even and the jobs that are being quote unquote stolen are the ones that we don't really even want to do, right? Which is working on the fields 16 hours a day for like 50 cents an hour or something that illegal immigrants get paid. A lot of times it's running away from violence and just
Hmm.
basically not really having any other option and just having to uproot your entire life and move over. And that's what happened for my mom. The other thing that it isn't really widely known, but continues to be a pretty stable fact, is that the first generation of illegal immigrants end up paying significantly more taxes than what illegal immigrants or their families take out of the system. So having these people and us kind of come in, um, going through the education system, building our own careers, and then paying back in taxes. And I can tell you, I've paid a lot of taxes from the companies that I've worked with. I've absolutely have paid more than what my mom has taken from the system. It actually is it's a net positive for the United States. I don't think that um, that immigration is truly like a problem or illegal immigration is a problem like this. I think it's a really easy sort of like thing to point at and just start to blame for
Mm.
other things that might be going wrong, right? So, what we saw in this election was prices of groceries have gone up significantly, and that's because of illegal immigration somehow. But that's not necessarily true. A lot of it has been because of the quantitative easing and money that was pumped into the system due to the pandemic, that naturally caused inflation. That's actually Trump himself. It has nothing to do with illegal immigrants, but it's much easier to point at these people that don't have rights within the country and say it's their fault. And then everybody like just kind of easily accepts it and just starts to push that narrative more and more. I think the other fact that I really love is that illegal immigrants commit significantly less crime than natural born citizens from the United States. Significantly less, much smaller rate. But I don't know, there's this perception that they're the most dangerous people around, when in reality, they're just trying to make a life for themselves.
It's interesting as you say this because I think one, right, as you mentioned, is that oftentimes we as humans, we want to blame somebody,
Yeah.
right? We need to place the blame somewhere. And some of these concepts that you were mentioning are kind of these like abstract concepts, like with the economy, right? I don't know if you've seen that commercial, like with Progressive, and they're like the economy, and like, well, what's the economy?
Yeah.
Well, it's the right. It's like I can't really put my finger on it, but when I can blame a group of individuals, whether or not those individuals are responsible, right?
Yeah.
I could place my blame there. And now my frustrations, my angers, all of those things I can get out. I think I was mentioning to you, not too long ago, Chicago is a sanctuary city.
Yeah.
And obviously we have a number of issues dealing with like homelessness, especially the Black population of just struggling. And I
Yeah.
remember in the pawn game, as I was calling it, like DeSantis was bussing groups of individuals up to Chicago saying, well, if you're a sanctuary city here, take them.
Yeah.
Right. And then like, okay, well, let's find housing. Let's provide some resources for these individuals. And it started this, whether intentionally or not, it started this clash between two groups of people where those who were already residing here said, wait a second, like we were here and you're not doing these things for us, right? And it started brewing into this hatred for this group coming in when in reality they weren't doing anything
Yeah.
necessarily. They were just being the recipients. But I remember even hearing those conversations within my building, right? And you're right. I think that so oftentimes narratives just duplicate without understanding,
Yeah.
without really diving deep, and we just duplicate. And so I'm curious what I really want to connect this back to then is based off of what we're sharing here. Like, why do you think that this is important for educators to hear? This idea that there are these harmful, negative, and untrue narratives around these individuals who are coming into the country, whether it's illegally or not. There are these harmful, untrue narratives, oftentimes being strewn about and repeated over and over again.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I would say that it's a concern for me is how these assumptions or narratives can ultimately impact kids um, unfairly. So if we have these implicit biases or biases, assumptions that uh, minority kids are more violent or are just not going to do as well in school, then all of a sudden educators have lower expectations for these students to do well, and they don't push them as hard as they would somebody that they would expect to do a lot better. And it's just kind of like a natural thing that people aren't thinking about. And so it becomes an implicit bias, and it just negatively impacts the student population of these groups of students um, without them having done anything wrong. But just because it's something that's been put into people's like imaginations or assumptions, there's a negative impact, and it just becomes a reoccurring sort of situation where like we have low expectations, so then they don't perform, and then that confirms our confirmation bias. And so then we have low expectations for the next generation, and then you just never get that group out of there. But if you look at the real facts about this, is like there's been a lot of people from these groups of people that have been plenty successful in the United States,
Mhm.
even going against some of these implicit biases that I'm sure we've all faced at some point in our lives.
And I'm glad that you brought that up because you're absolutely right. Right there are these implicit biases that we carry. It's going to negatively impact how we think about, how we treat, how we
Yeah,
respond to those students in our spaces. And oftentimes we talk about this concept of cultural capital, right? That a student comes in and because they can't speak the language, that somehow they are inferior, that somehow they are inept, somehow that they have a lower intellectual standing. When in reality, right, there's a language barrier.
yeah,
That if you were to present that to me in my native language, I could probably rock that thing out, right? But because I'm learning a new concept, one, but I'm also trying to overcome the acquisition of a new language, that presents an additional barrier. And I know oftentimes, when I worked in this department for many years, that was one of the challenges that I had with teachers of saying, like, they were like, well, they're so good at math. And I said, well, in many ways math is just numbers, right?
yeah.
Numbers aren't going to change
Exactly. You
from
don't need
language to
to know
language.
English to learn math, right? And I mean,
Exactly, unless
math is
unless it's a
done.
story problem.
Yeah,
But like, numbers are numbers,
numbers are
right?
numbers.
But if I were to present you something in a foreign language, like, how smart are you suddenly?
Exactly. I went to this really amazing event at Stanford a few weeks ago, and we were looking, or they were looking into the performance of Latino students in California and why they were underperforming other groups. And one of the things that I learned in that situation, and maybe like this is obvious to the listeners of this podcast, is that people that are going through the ESL, or I think you called it the ELS program, right, where they're trying to learn English as a second language, a lot of times they have to take this proficiency exam that even native
Mm-hmm.
speakers may sometimes not be able to pass. And while they're not able to pass, they don't get the same resources, the availability, they don't get access to the same resources as the rest of the students in the school. And because they're not getting the same resources, the same help, they end up falling behind in school, and just kind of becomes once again one of these like self-fulfilling prophecies where you're holding somebody back because they don't speak English perfectly, then they can't learn math and geography and all these other subjects, um, because they're in this ESL program that's kind of holding them back until they pass this really difficult test. And so yeah, it's hard to break out of it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because so two things that immediately came to mind. One is you're absolutely right. This idea there's this proficiency test, and I don't know if it's the same from state to state to state, but I know at least here in Illinois, right? There's what we call the home language survey, right? You take that as you're being enrolled, and you're right there. If if you mark anything beyond English, there's a
Yeah,
proficiency test that you have to take. And I remember oftentimes we would have these young students. Oftentimes, I've worked in spaces that were predominantly African American, and I was like, why are you in this bilingual program?
yeah,
And I spoke to mom or dad, and they're like, well, because I thought it would better their odds if I said they spoke another language. Well, the only reason they enter the program was because they couldn't pass the proficiency test.
Yeah.
And it just isn't a testament to what you were just saying, is that there's this assessment that is very, very challenging, even for native English speakers.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, then because of that, the placement of individuals, because my wife, she is currently still working with ELs. I mentioned to you earlier, she's from Guadalajara. She was one of these students in the American system. And so she shares with me every year about how she has to, and I'll use air quotes for those of you listening, she has to rescue EL students who are thrown into special ed classrooms
Yeah.
because they don't speak the language, and they're like, well, they can't do the other work and your space is full, so we're going to throw them in there. And she's like, that is not fair, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you're surfacing, a lot of these things that inadvertently come out of these biases that we either inherently carry, right, or that are being perpetuated within mainstream media.
Yeah. And this is where I'm really hoping that technology and I'm not going to act like I'm some savior for the education system in the United States. I mean, I bring a skill set that I feel like has been missing within the system. But I think technology can help quite a bit. Especially with the next generation of AI that we're seeing these days, it's becoming much easier to translate what's being said directly to a person's ear, just as they're like listening, and then they can respond back and then have that being translated back. Like we've seen it in sci-fi movies for many years, and now it's becoming kind of a reality, right? So there's no real requirement to say like you have to know English perfectly in order to learn every single other subject that's there. Yeah, English should absolutely continue to be like one of the fields that you focus on in school, but it shouldn't hold you back from everything else. And so if we can, let's say, get into a world where people that don't speak English proficiently, they get like one of these earpieces where a teacher can still teach in English so that they don't have to worry about having to translate things. And then they're getting that translation so that they can understand it in their natural language. Then they can continue to learn like in those math classes and, like I said, other classes along with every other student while still working on passing that English proficiency test.
Well, Jose, I think this is a perfect, kind of segue into that space because, as we're moving throughout, one of the questions I always ask is like, well, what can educators do? Because I'm sure there are people listening to this, watching this right now, who are saying, yes, 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 I'm trying to be an advocate. I'm trying to do this thing. But you're right? There are these barriers in place. I don't know how to overcome them. I don't know how to help, especially when there is a language barrier and I cannot speak this other language. And you mentioned already, maybe these earpieces, and you're right? It's sci-fi coming to life, where translations could happen in real time. And so if I'm an educator and I am either working with an EL group, or I have EL students within my space, and I'm really trying to be an advocate, I'm really trying to make sure that they're successful in my space and even beyond, in my neighbor's classroom and beyond, what are some practical tools, whether it's AI and technology or maybe some other things where I can implement? Maybe low-hanging fruit, because that earpiece sounds amazing, but I'm also like, do we have the budget for that? It would be amazing. But
See,
like, maybe on both ends, what are some things that come to mind?
I would say number one, if you haven't looked at ChatGPT or Claude or any of these AI generative solutions, I would say please open yourself and start experimenting with it, because one of the things that you can very easily do is that translation job. You can now create your homework in the way that you've always done it, right? Give it to ChatGPT and say, like, can you make this in Spanish for me? Make it in French, whatever. And then ChatGPT will spit it out. It won't be perfect. It's not going to be like the most pristine Spanish or French, but it'll be honestly 98% of the way there. And to the point where the student can receive that in the language that they're comfortable with and be able to understand it and work on it. And then you could translate it back if you need to, if they wrote in that language. I know that a lot of I think part of the answer is I don't know. And that's something that I'm continuing to explore and trying to figure out how we can continue to have impact here. But there's a lot of like regulations and expectations and just the way that things are right within the system today. And you really have to work on I guess, higher ups in being able to be open to change some of those systems that they've put in place to say like, yeah, maybe we should try this out where English isn't required. And so you have to get buy-in from superintendents and potentially from state representatives to be able to do these things. In California, I've started getting connected with some of these superintendents that are starting to push a little bit more and more for this. They told one of the stories that they told was that in one of their schools that was really struggling, very Spanish dominant, they were asking, it was elementary school, they were asking parents to read with their kids every single night, working a couple of jobs, blah, blah. Teachers weren't buying in, saying it wasn't really going to happen, not for that school anyways. But it turned out that a big barrier was the fact that most of the parents spoke Spanish and they had trouble communicating with like the school. And so what the school ended up putting into place was an app that translated the book from English to Spanish and Spanish to English, so that the parents themselves can be involved and read to their kids in Spanish, even if it's not English, but they're still like taking that part and working with those kids and teaching them those skills of reading, doing their homework, and kind of moving things forward, right? And by releasing that app that was translating the books from English to Spanish, they got engagement numbers for the parents up. And then that ended up getting performance scores up for the students in that school. I think it was one of the best improvements that they saw in the district that year. And so with a lot of the new technology that's out there, I think there are more and more options for how to move things forward. A lot of it is going to be kind of experimentation and really looking at the data to figure out what's working and what isn't, and then just kind of adjusting and trying to push things forward. And that's where we're hoping that we'll be able to help with a lot of our sort of like data-driven mentality that we bring in.
Man, I love that story. It's just, I think it's a testament to that there are always opportunities,
Yeah.
right? You can sit back and you can make excuses, or you could find those opportunities and you could push forward. And so, yeah, like to say, oh, parent engagement is horrible. Nobody's going to do anything. It's not going to work. Right. But a simple fix said, hey, we're going to be able to make sure that these parents are engaged. And I think this is a conversation for another time, but even just the myth of the absent parent, right? And I did a whole podcast reflection on that, just this idea like, well, parents don't want to, no, like most parents are absolutely, invested in their child's education.
Yeah.
But they don't always have the tools or resources to be able to do so. And so when a school is able to create that pathway, right, not only are the parents now involved, but as you also mentioned within this district, then we also then started seeing performance, right? There's that snowball effect, that chain reactions, because we said, how can I break down a barrier to make sure that you can be an active participant? So I love that story.
Exactly. I think if I were to attribute like my success to anything, one of the biggest things I would say is my mom's mentality that education is so important. It was always supposed to be such a huge focus, right? And just showing what can be achievable through education, I think is a good way to get buy-in from parents to really help their kids try to move forward.
Man, well, I do appreciate it. I've had some opportunities to work with a company here in Chicago, Learning Forward, talking about this idea of building apps, right? And not even just waiting for something to be created, but building them ourselves. And one of the guys I remember in the space talked about, and this goes back to when you were like the perfect translation. He was like, most people, the Spanish that we learn in schools, that's not the Spanish that we speak.
No.
Right? The same way with the English. It's not the English that we speak. So he built a Spanglish one, and he was like, and it worked.
I still don't know accents, how to like write down accents, but I can speak Spanish. I can read it, and I can write it well enough for people to understand what I'm trying to say. But my accent placement is horrible. It's just so bad.
Hey, I get it. I remember doing like the vocab test, and they're like, put the. I just was marking it. I was like, it's like 3 questions. I'll get the rest of it right. I'll be fine. Like, and to this day, like I've never had to worry about that. I know how to pronounce the word. I don't know where the little mark goes. Like I know how to pronounce it. So
I've always been a math person. I would like calculate how much of a hit my test score would take if I don't put the accents in the right place. And I was like, yeah, I can accept that grade. And so I just like got with it without it. Did not make my teachers happy, but
I love it. I love it. Well, Jose, before we jump off, how can people find you? Whether it's you personally, like on the socials, whether it's the company, if they want to learn more, and maybe I know y'all, if you're listening, they do demos. So if you check it out on the website, but how can people find you? How can they learn more about the work that you're doing?
I think I'm most active on LinkedIn these days. So Jose Moreno, and then if you search New Light, NEULIGHT, I should pop up. But also check out our website, NEULIGHT, newlight.io. You can see we have a lot of product videos that we just put on there to talk about IntelliTier. And we have an option to contact us. I'm reading every single one of those contact forms that are coming in. And then, like you mentioned, there's an option to book a demo. I'm also personally running most of those demos along with my co-founder. I'm more than happy to chat about IntelliTier or other opportunities where we can help build, I guess, the next software to help move things forward. IntelliTier, honestly, that's kind of the introduction that we're bringing into the space to show what we can do and what's possible and how we're different from the traditional EdTech companies that have been out there. We're thinking about what's next.
That is wonderful. And I do have some EdTech friends I definitely want to connect you with. I think that,
That'd be amazing.
we're going to drag you into our Edu space here, become a member of the Edu crew. So Jose, I just want to say thank you so much,
Thank you.
obviously for being on the show tonight. I know it's only, we got a few hours between us. So obviously just thank you for jumping on the show. But more importantly, thank you so much for this work that you're doing. I'm excited to see, the impact your expertise and knowledge might have on our space of education. And this is just a testament again to this idea of how worlds can collaborate and improve one another. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was great. And yeah, hopefully we can make this successful.
Absolutely. Well, friends, those of you watching, those of you listening, as always, until next time.